The whitewashed town of Andalusia clung to the Andalusian hills like a whispered prayer long forgotten. Cobbled alleys twisted through lemon groves and stone courtyards, where laughter was rare and the scent of warm bread floated alongside quiet resignation. Time here moved not with the hours, but with seasons of drought and faded fortunes. Catalina Moya stood behind the counter of her mother's apothecary, fingers stained with the crushed lavender she ground into fine powder. The mortar groaned softly in her hand. Shelves lined with herbs looked more ceremonial than medicinal now, half empty, patched with bundles tied in frayed twine. The shop, once alive with trade and whispers of healing, had become a tomb of memories. Her father's portrait still hung above the window, his eyes painted with pride he hadn't lived to see collapse into debt. Her hands never shook, but her smile rarely reached past her lips. Catalina had learned early that beauty was both a blessing and a curse. Men came for the shape of her cheekbones, for her voice soft as dusk, but left the moment they saw the rotting ledgers or smelled the vinegar used to hide the scent of mold creeping through the walls. It was during such a slow afternoon, the kind when silence hums louder than the flies on the ceiling, that he walked in. Dust clung to his boots like a map of roads long traveled. His shirt was sun-faded, sleeves rolled to reveal the kind of arms shaped not by vanity, but by burden. He paused just inside the doorway, where light split across the tiled floor. His eyes, dark as spilled ink, swept the room, and then rested on her, not with hunger, not with pity, but something far more dangerous, recognition. "I need calendula," he said quietly, his voice lined with something foreign, nobility, perhaps, buried under fatigue. "And salt, for my grandmother's joints." Catalina nodded without speaking, turning toward the wooden drawers behind her. She felt his gaze remain, steady as a held breath. When she placed the wrapped herbs on the counter, he handed her coins that didn't quite match in size or kingdom, and left without a word more. He came again the next day. And the day after that. At first, he bought only small things, peppermint, beeswax, sage. But soon he lingered, mending a cracked shelf with care, helping her mother lift crates too heavy for Catalina to move alone. He never asked for credit, never spoke of his past, never overstepped. And still, it was as if he belonged there, as naturally as sunlight slipping through wooden blinds. He said his name was Matteo. No surname followed. No mention of a father, no stories of a village or land to call his own. When asked where he was from, he only smiled and replied, "Where the road ends, I begin again." The townsfolk began to whisper, as they always did. Who was this stranger who carried himself like a noble but swept floors like a servant? Catalina's mother narrowed her eyes whenever he came. Men who speak little often hide much, she warned her daughter. Especially the ones with kindness in their eyes. But Catalina had spent too long with men who spoke too much and meant too little. Matteo did not flatter. He did not ask her to dance or promise her riches or speak of a future with embroidered children and orchards. Instead, he asked how her knees felt after kneeling too long. He noticed when her left hand trembled from the old burn she never spoke of. He said her rosemary bundles were tied too tightly and helped her loosen them. And he looked at her like she wasn't just someone to admire, but someone to understand. One night, the festival bells rang down in the town square. Music floated up through the hills, catching in the lemon trees and the iron railings of the apothecary's small balcony. But Catalina stayed inside, scrubbing dried lavender from her nails. Matteo appeared in the doorway, hair still damp from washing, shirt clean but worn. He didn't ask her to come dance. Instead, he walked with her into the moonlit garden behind the shop, where figs hung ripe and heavy in the still summer air. Beneath the old tree where her father once read aloud on Sundays, Matteo stood silently for a long time. Then he took her hand. "If I had nothing," he said, his voice nearly swallowed by the chirp of crickets, "truly nothing, no home, no name, no coin, would you still look at me this way?" She didn't pull her hand away. The warmth of his skin surprised her, rough yet careful, as though he was afraid to break her. "If your heart is true," she said without blinking, "I would marry you in bare feet beneath this tree." The moon caught the shine in his eyes before he looked down and kissed the center of her palm. It was not a kiss of desire, but of reverence, like she was something sacred. He didn't speak again. He didn't stay. By morning, he was gone. A week passed. Then 2. The apothecary door remained open longer than it should have, catching every breeze and every footfall on the dusty path that wound down from the hills. Catalina waited as if time itself might reverse course and deliver him back to her. Each sunset deepened the ache in her ribs. Each silence grew heavier. Villaloosa, with all its watchful eyes and tight mouths, had begun to notice. Too handsome for a peasant, they muttered behind linens and bread stalls. Vanished too suddenly, a drifter, a fraud. Or worse, a thief come to seduce the girl and rob her blind. The whispers darted through the village like wasps, sharp and persistent. Catalina bore them with quiet dignity, but inside, each word tore a little deeper. And then, one morning, the world shifted. It began with the sound of hooves, measured, deliberate, unfamiliar. Catalina looked up from arranging jars of crushed thyme to see shadows stretching across the plaza like specters. A carriage rolled into Villaloosa, black as night, carved in sweeping Andalusian flourishes. The horses were massive, high-stepping Andalusians clad in silver-trimmed harnesses. The villagers poured from their homes as if summoned by ancient bells. The coach stopped before the apothecary. The door opened. What emerged was not the Mateo she had known. He stepped down in a coat of deep burgundy velvet, stitched with gold threads. His boots gleamed like polished mirrors. Rings glinted on his fingers. Behind him stood 3 men, silent, dark-clothed, servants without names. Catalina's knees nearly buckled. Gasps fluttered like birds taking flight. The butcher's wife dropped a basket. Children stared with round, unblinking eyes. This was not a man returning. This was a spectacle. A statement. Don Mateo de Herrera. Heir to one of the wealthiest estates in all of Seville. A name whispered only during wine-fueled gossip or wrapped in envy. The Herreras owned vineyards that bled into the horizon, land granted by kings, and cellars so vast they echoed like cathedrals. And he had once swept her floors. Mateo stepped across the plaza, his boots silent on the sun-warmed stones. Catalina stood in the doorway, her heart torn between disbelief and something dangerously like betrayal. He paused before her, eyes never leaving hers, and then, before 100 witnesses, he dropped to one knee. Gasps again. He pulled a ring from his coat, a deep blue sapphire encircled by gold, carved with the Herrera crest. The kind of ring that belonged in portraits, in vaults. Catalina, he said, his voice clear, unwavering, I hid who I was not to deceive you, but to find the truth in you. To see if your heart would choose the men without the vineyard, without the title, without the wealth. And you did. The ring caught the sun, casting a ribbon of light between them. You said you would marry a poor man, he continued. But will you still marry me, knowing I am not? The crowd held its breath. A fruit vendor crossed herself. A child whispered something about fairy tales. Catalina did not move. She looked at the men kneeling before her, not the Mateo who patched cracked shelves, who kissed her hand beneath the fig tree, who asked for calendula like a commoner. This man wore polish, carried legacy in his posture, power in every breath. He was not the ghost of a laborer. He was a prince in disguise. And yet. I loved the men who swept our floors, she said, her voice barely louder than the hum of wind. The one who carried sacks for my mother and asked for nothing in return. Not this lord with rings and horses and men who follow him like shadows. The ring trembled slightly in his hand. Which one are you now? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The villagers reacted audibly, some gasping, others murmuring disbelief. A girl clutched her mother's shawl. The town priest turned slightly away, unsure whether this moment was sacred or profane. Mateo's expression cracked, not with anger, but with sorrow. I am both, he said. I am the son of a rich man. But I am also the orphan who healed in your garden. The boy who was sent to war and came back looking for peace in your laughter. He looked up at her, the kneeling posture no longer a gesture of romance but one of surrender. I became poor by choice to meet you with no walls between us. I only ask that you see me now without walls, too. But Catalina didn't reach for the ring. Didn't kneel. Her hands remained at her sides, clenched softly in her skirts. I don't know how to love someone who's 2 men, she said. Pain flickered in his eyes, but he stood, slowly, gracefully, like a man who had practiced losing as often as winning. I never meant to split myself in 2, he murmured. They stared at each other as if both were searching for the remnants of the other, traces of who they had been in that garden, beneath the figs, before the truth had worn a velvet coat and knocked on her door with the sound of hoofs. Without another word, Matteo turned. The ring remained in his palm, unclaimed. The crowd parted as he walked to his carriage. The horses stirred. The wheels creaked. He never looked back. That night, the whispers in Villa Lusa burned like wildfire. She turned down a lord. She shamed a noble in the square. She must be mad. Catalina sat alone in the apothecary as lanterns flickered low and moths danced against the windows. Her mother said nothing. Only poured her a cup of bitter root tea and placed it before her with trembling hands. Catalina didn't cry. But she didn't sleep either. Because no matter how much gold lined a man's name, it could never weigh what it cost to wonder which part of him had been real. And the silence that followed his departure felt louder than anything he'd ever spoken. Autumn settled over Villa Lusa like a silk shawl, soft and gold, catching in the olive trees and weighing down the wind. The town's whitewashed walls turned honeyed under the shifting sun, and the scent of ripening figs mixed with the distant hum of pressed grapes in stone barrels. In the apothecary, time moved differently, measured not by hours, but by memories. Catalina moved through her days with practiced grace, restocking jars, grinding roots, folding herbs into parchment. The shelves, once bare and mournful, had begun to brim again, jars of rare salts, imported oils, dried petals she hadn't seen in years. Crates of goods arrived unmarked, but sealed with care. No merchant laid claim to them. No name was ever given. She never asked. Her mother counted it as luck. Catalina knew better. Each new bundle reminded her of him, not the lord in velvet, but the men who once tied bundles of rosemary too tightly, who carried water without being asked, who kissed her palm as if it were the most sacred part of her. The townspeople forgot quickly. Whispers faded into winter preparation and harvest. But Catalina's silence grew louder. She could feel it in the space he once filled, in the ache that pulsed not with longing but with something colder, uncertainty. Had she let something true slip through her fingers? Or had she merely seen the face behind the mask too late? Rumors drifted south with the migrating birds. That Don Matteo had returned to his estate. That he refused every noble match his father proposed. That he dismissed his advisors, refused parties, and walked his vineyards alone at dusk. Some said he had gone mad with heartbreak. Others whispered he was cursed by a village girl's rejection. Catalina never spoke his name. But every lavender bloom in her shop felt like a letter unopened. One gray afternoon, just as the mist curled over the hills and the fire inside the shop struggled against the chill, a figure appeared in the doorway. Catalina's mother went still. He was old. Bent, wrapped in wool rags that clung like wet moss. His beard was yellowed with age. One eye was clouded over, the other sunken. He didn't speak. Only trembled. Catalina stepped forward before her mother could, guiding the men to a chair near the hearth. She poured broth from a clay pot, wrapped his hands with linen, and offered him dried cherries she'd saved from summer. Her mother frowned in the corner, arms crossed, disapproving. "Why?" she whispered later, when the men slept curled near the fire. Catalina met her gaze. "You once told me kindness without cost is the rarest thing." Her voice trembled just slightly. "Matteo showed me that. I will not unlearn it." Her mother said nothing more. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. The embers burned low. Catalina rose once to check on the stranger, but his place was empty. The chair was cold. In his place sat a letter. It was folded tightly and bound in gold thread. The wax seal bore no crest, only the imprint of a fig leaf. Catalina stared at it for a long time, afraid to touch it, as if the paper itself might burn her. She opened it only after the fire had died, and the room was lit only by starlight through the window. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, deliberate, shaped by a mind that had tasted both discipline and longing. Forgive me for testing a heart so good. But I had to know, would you love the men, not the name? And you did. You still do, But I fear I have ruined what could have been. If you ever wish to walk this life with me, come at sunrise to the old vineyard arch. No carriages. No titles. Just you and me. No riches. No deception, if not. I will carry your name in silence, and never return again, Matteo. She read it once. Then again. Outside, the stars scattered across the sky like broken promises and half-spoken prayers. The fig tree in the garden swayed gently, its shadow stretching toward the house like a memory reaching back. Catalina folded the letter, held it to her lips, and closed her eyes. Her heart beat louder than the wind. When the first blush of morning touched the hills, she left. No note. No explanation. Just the soft click of the apothecary door and the echo of her steps down the stone path. The morning air wrapped around Catalina like a prayer. The sky was still soft with sleep, painted in shades of pearl and lavender. She walked alone, her footsteps silent on the winding path that led through ancient olive groves. The leaves glistened with dew, catching the first light of dawn like trembling tears. The hills breathed mist, each rise and curve like the fold of a memory. Not even the birds had begun to sing. Stone bridges arched over dry creeks, their worn surfaces slick beneath her soles. Every step forward felt like unraveling a knot inside her chest, fear, longing, defiance, hope, all tangled into the shape of a woman who had once believed love could be simple. Now she knew better. Love was never simple. But it could still be true. The vineyard loomed ahead, still cloaked in fog. The vines stretched in silent rows, bare now, their fruit harvested, their branches waiting for spring. At the very edge stood the old arch. It had once marked the boundary between two estates before time forgot both. Now ivy strangled its stones, and moss grew in its cracks. Yet it stood tall, weathered but enduring, just like the promises people were too afraid to make. She waited there, beneath its reach, her breath steady despite her trembling hands. The silence pressed against her ears. Her heart beat louder than the wind. Then, out of the mist, he appeared. No carriage. No cloak. No crest. Just Matteo, his linen shirt clinging damp to his frame, boots worn from the road, hair tousled as if the wind itself had tried to hold him back. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world held its breath. Neither spoke. Then his voice, roughened by the cold and the ache between them, broke through. Did I lose you forever? She stepped toward him, slowly, as if closing the final distance between all that had been said and all that had been left unsaid. You never had to test me, Matteo, she said softly. Love isn't a trick. It's a choice. His shoulders dropped, as if a weight he'd carried for too long finally loosened its grip. I know that now, he whispered. From his pocket, he pulled the ring, not in a box, not wrapped in silk, but bare in his hand. The sapphire still gleamed, deep as midnight, but it no longer looked like something meant to dazzle. It looked like something offered. This ring carries a name, he said, holding it out, but it means nothing without you. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she took his hand. I don't want a vineyard, she said. I don't want silk or titles. I want the men who swept my mother's floors. Who kissed my palm beneath a fig tree and meant it. The tears came without warning, warm against the chill in her cheeks. And I want to be the woman who believed in him, when no one else did. His fingers tightened around hers. And softly, with a smile that held all the forgiveness neither of them had spoken, she said, yes. They did not wed in a cathedral with bells or choirs. They married there, beneath the ivy-covered arch, while the sun climbed slow and golden over the hills. The vineyard workers stood in a half-circle, caps in their hands, eyes wet with quiet wonder. Catalina's mother came wrapped in a shawl that smelled of rosemary, her face streaked with silent tears that held both regret and relief. There were no invitations. No nobles. No silver spoons or lace trains. Only truth, and the courage to hold it without shame. As the first rays of sunlight touched the stones, Matteo and Catalina exchanged no elaborate vows. Just eyes that saw clearly now. Just hands that had held and let go and now held again. The ring slid onto her finger. Not as a prize. Not as a promise of wealth. But as a circle without beginning or end. He had hidden his name to test the strength of her heart. But her answer gave him something far greater than he ever sought. Not love born from riches. But love that made riches meaningless.